Dead Space 2 is exactly what a sequel should be. In the past, it's been referred to as the Aliens compared to Dead Space's Alien, but that's not wholly correct. While the original is a little more horror-focused, it was also action-packed in its own right. Dead Space 2 simply leans a touch more into the series' frenetic side, dialing everything up by a notch or two with its larger arsenal of weapons, grander set pieces, and far more varied settings compared to its predecessor. That was in part due to developer Visceral Games' creative vision, but it was undoubtedly also a reaction to the first game's underwhelming sales. Make no mistake though, while 2 is definitely more action orientated, it's still a horror title in its own right, even if a few of its scarier edges have been sanded down. Nowhere is there a better demonstration of Visceral's commitment to producing a bigger, badder, bolder sequel than Dead Space 2's opening minutes. After a short scene of a more intimate moment between protagonist Isaac Clarke and his deceased girlfriend Nicole, which I'll touch on again momentarily, the game begins proper with Isaac sat in a straitjacket, trying desperately to remember the years gone since his time on the USG Ishimura.
You were part of the repair mission. A mission for which you volunteered, am I right? What did you find aboard that ship, Isaac?
I found something.
This brief interview is used to both remind us of Dead Space's story and reintroduce Nicole as a haunting presence, making it very clear that, like the original, she will be around for much of your time spent with Isaac. Jogging your memory of the series' backstory using this method might not seem like anything particularly exciting, but it is, as it's done in-world and adheres to a design principle so important to the series. That is, that as much as possible of what you experience is diegetic, it's built into the world, so that you and, crucially, Isaac experience it together. It's one of Dead Space's defining characteristics, and it really can be found everywhere. Much of the HUD, for example, functions similarly, including the health meter on Isaac's back and the waypoints he projects onto the floor. Likewise, video communication between Isaac and other characters, text and audio logs, and even video messages beamed from dead bodies are all displayed so that you and Isaac can see them. It is the perfect way to make you empathise with him as much as humanly possible. You and Isaac receive exactly the same information, whether it's via the HUD or in-world storytelling, and it absolutely helps you feel closer to him, even if he is much less of a blank slate compared to his mute turn in Dead Space. You are also given the option to watch a much more comprehensive video recap from the main menu should you require a more detailed synopsis, but it's testament to Visceral's brilliant work that it isn't really necessary. The introduction's early period of relative calm doesn't last for long, as Dead Space Ignition's Franco Delisle frees Isaac before being promptly turned into a necromorph in beautifully grisly fashion.
Listen, you're in terrible danger.
You are left alone to escape the chaos during what is essentially Dead Space's opening turned up to 11. There you were briefly unarmed as you raced down a corridor to an elevator, whereas in 2 you're on the run without a gun for considerably longer. It's a very linear affair to the point of being almost haunted house-like in its execution as you duck and dive down hallways as necromorphs emerge from all angles, but regardless, it does a stellar job of conveying the mayhem that would so quickly ensue should a necromorph outbreak occur. As a huge fan of zombie films and those involving outbreaks of weird contagions and similar, a golden opportunity many of them miss is to show society crumbling. Instead, they often opt to begin their tales well after an outbreak has happened. It is far scarier watching the world fall to pieces to see the familiar transition to something decidedly unfamiliar than it is to be met with the unfamiliar to begin with. By seeing things how they were, by experiencing normality even for the briefest of moments, you're far better able to understand the contrast between the old world and the new. Dead Space 2 does this fantastically well. It's a game that sets out its stall early, it wants you to know that the series is back and means business, and it does this by putting you in Isaac's shoes at the beginning of an outbreak, rather than when one is already well underway.
Isaac, we're all gonna burn for what we did to you.
In the first game, it was your job to pick up the pieces, whereas in Dead Space 2, you watch on with horror as everything falls apart around you. Once proceedings get going proper, you'll soon notice that the greater attention paid to storytelling during the introduction is present throughout much of the rest of the game as well. Dead Space's story was a good one, which paired well with the more traditional horror vibe it sometimes went for. You met several semi-interesting characters along the way, although Isaac and to a lesser extent Nicole were definitely the stars of the show, their relationship the narrative's major focus. While it could be argued that is still the case at times in the sequel, the majority of the cast who joins them for the second instalment are much more fleshed out compared to the original's supporting characters. That was only possible due to how much more of a character Isaac himself becomes. Formerly a mute protagonist whose face you never really even saw, I was never a fan of him being silent in the original. A first-person shooter like Half-Life could just about get away with it due to its perspective and Gordon Freeman's limited conversations with scientists and other non-playable characters, but Dead Space being in third person combined with the amount of radio communication used made Isaac's silence seem a bit weird. Very weird, honestly. He never uttered a single syllable, even during moments when clear and constant communication were vitally important, and Dead Space's recent remake quite rightly rectified that issue, giving Isaac a voice. Dead Space 2, though, was the trailblazer in that regard, with our favourite engineer, unmasked and talkative from the outset, immediately helping foster far deeper characterisation than anything the first game had to offer.
Dana, your fucking route didn't work. There's a security lockdown.
I told you to hurry. How'd you miss it?
Look, I don't need your help.
Fine. Let's see how long you last without it.
That is especially true given the Isaac you're reintroduced to is very clearly a complete mess, plagued by visions of his former girlfriend Nicole, all the more harrowing to witness given the brief glimpses at the game's start which reveal it was Isaac who encouraged Nicole to work aboard the USG Ishimura. His feelings of guilt and lack of understanding of his predicament creates a similar but also very different feel to the original, if that makes any sense whatsoever. Isaac was in a very alien situation during Dead Space because he'd never witnessed anything like what was unfolding. In 2, it's the same but due to memory loss. Isaac fought his way through wave after wave of necromorphs during Dead Space, trying to rescue Nicole. In 2, fighting the necromorphs not only gives him purpose in and of itself, but also a means to try and forget his guilt. In a way, dealing with the necromorphs this time is an attempt to escape Nicole, to try and forget, no matter how fruitless an endeavour that may ultimately be. If keeping busy is the name of the game for Isaac then, it's fortunate that the rest of 2's characters give him plenty else to focus on. Dana Le Guin and Hans Tiedemann serve as dual antagonists during the game's first half, and they are both reasonably well executed characters who arguably could have offered even more. There was a real opportunity with the pair. Dana represents the church, namely the religion Unitology, while Tiedemann represents the state, EarthGov, and it would have been fascinating to witness more of those institutions clashing. You do pick up some incidental details as you progress through the story, but the idea isn't used to anywhere near its full potential. You mostly deal with each separately, where further interaction between Dana and Tiedemann would have been the perfect opportunity to develop each faction's story. Dana's double cross, part of the first third's big finale, is also fairly telegraphed.
Dana! You're a unitologist. Of course you are. Why did I trust you?
Well, you didn't have a choice, Isaac. I told you there was a cure and you came running.
Assuming you played Dead Space, you will have already experienced a twist like it with Nicole, and so Le Guin, another female character acting as a guide, turning out not to be very nice, isn't an overly surprising turn of events. She could have been used to give more of an insight into unitology throughout proceedings, although Visceral does still give you some insight through environmental storytelling nonetheless, but she's killed off before she reveals much of anything. Tiedemann, on the other hand, is handled better. He's a man who does seem to care, at least in some capacity, for the citizens he's charged with protecting, but whose dogged attempts to understand the marker so he can harness its energy signs a death warrant for the people he's seemingly trying to protect.
This is not the way it was supposed to happen.
Well, how was it supposed to happen,
We
Tiedemann?
had it under control. Clarke, this is not our fault. We were so close to understanding it.
Where Le Guin is an out-and-out villain, it would be incredibly harsh to describe Tiedemann as such. He's a man with good intentions who unfortunately made several critical errors. By far the standout supporting character is Nolan Stross. A fellow patient of Isaac's, Stross initially lends a helping hand, even warning him as a leaper approaches early on.
Isaac, over here!
Who are you? It's the drugs, Isaac. They gave us drugs to make us forget. But it's all coming.
I don't know what you're talking about. Why are you calling me?
Isaac, Isaac, look out!
However, he quickly descends into madness before he is eventually dispatched by Isaac later in the story. He works so well as he's essentially a mirror for what Isaac could himself become should he fail to conquer his own demons and the influence the marker has over him. Stross even struggles with loss in the same manner Isaac does, but to an even greater degree, having killed his wife and son while under the influence of a marker fragment. Isaac finds his visions of Nicole distressing enough, so imagine the effect Stross seeing his young son must have had on him, a macabre reminder of what he did. As Stross loses his mind and transitions from friend to sort of foe, slowly becoming less and less lucid over time, him losing his grip on his sanity serves as a stark reminder that Isaac is living on borrowed time too, and must ultimately find peace if he's to avoid a similar fate. I'm a huge fan of Ellie Langford as well. She is unquestionably a fantastic character and as close to a series heroine as we get, even if Dead Space 3 does turn her into something of a caricature, a well-endowed damsel in distress present mostly for two men to fight over. And after Nicole and Dana's trickery, it is certainly refreshing to work alongside a woman rather than them eventually betraying you. Her introduction as someone who can hold their own just as well as Isaac can is excellent too.
Hey, I can help you. Besides, we got a better chance if we stick together. Don't you agree?
It's not a chance, Isaac. Other people are just a liability. I'll release the door lock, but after that you're on your own. And please, don't follow me, okay?
And she continues to persevere despite having a rough old time, again like Isaac. Ellie loses an eye to Stross as he reaches the peak of his delusions, but soldiers on, and she's also used to great effect as the story reaches its conclusion. More on that towards the end of the video. Apparently, there were even plans afoot at one stage for her to be the protagonist of Dead Space 4, which speaks to how great a character she mostly turned out to be. Visceral also pays the same attention to the game's overarching story and its pacing. Much of the moment-to-moment storytelling is admittedly centred around clearing whatever blockage is in your path, like in Dead Space, but the characters featured and the additional world building means that never feels like an issue. It may not be as pure a horror story as the original, but with 2's expanded scope, that wouldn't have worked as well anyway. The story is essentially a tale of two halves, or rather a tale of a third and then another two-thirds, which I like to refer to as pre and post Dana. That first third, up until you reach her demise, has a real sense of energy about it as you race to find her as quickly as possible. Indeed, your efforts to locate your eventual betrayer are the primary focus of the plot until her death, with other characters introduced and somewhat fleshed out along the way. Exploring setting the sprawl, the air is thick with resident screams, you catch sight of many of them too, and you're very much in the midst of everything going on. It's action-packed, there's never any real opportunity to relax, and quiet moments are few and far between. It is Dead Space 2 at its most relentless. Once Dana kicks the bucket, however, things settle down for a time. You even revisit a few areas you traversed early on, the gigantic atrium containing an equally massive replica marker being a highlight. Pre-Dana, it was a place filled with blood and violence. Post-Dana, like many other nearby areas, it's far more eerie, filled with candles, strange symbols, and silence. It's around this time the plot shifts its focus firmly from Dana to Stross, Ellie and Tiedemann, who remain the most important secondary characters throughout. Getting past somewhat random blockages is still the name of the game during this section, but the story holds its own and uses Stross to great effect to keep events ticking along. Last but not least, Dead Space 2's final third effectively begins when you board the mining drill towards the end of Chapter 12, after which events continue to intensify at pace. There are constant battles against huge numbers of enemies, another unkillable necromorph enters the fray. In the original it was the Hunter and in 2 it's the Ubermorph, and there's this sequence involving Isaac's eye and a rather large needle, a scene no one forgets in a hurry. All in all, it's a confidently paced tale which does exactly what it needs to. The first third acts as an extended introduction to the rest of the game, which contains the real meat of the story. An action-packed start becomes more contemplative for a time around the game's middle, although things don't slow down that much, before proceedings rapidly pick up pace again as the grand finale approaches. While we're talking about pacing, the effect Dead Space 2's linearity has on it must be acknowledged. If Dead Space regularly took you from A to B and then back to A again, its sequel is more of a straight line, a singular journey from point A to point B, one which constantly pushes you forwards through narrow environments which generally present less opportunity to explore off the beaten track. It's not as if there wasn't scope to open up areas either, which underscores Visceral's level design being wholly intentional. Many locked doors are presented which could have been left open to allow for exploration, but instead, the story dictates that Isaac must always be ploughing ever forward, and thus they must always remain closed. You move through environments during gameplay just as rapidly as events unfold across cinematics, and their shared focus on maintaining a breakneck tempo makes 2 feel relatively distinct from its predecessor in terms of how it ebbs and flows. That linearity also frees up Visceral to be particularly deliberate when it comes to encounter design. It's somewhat reminiscent of the original Resident Evil 4, another third-person action horror classic, which is no surprise at all considering Visceral referenced Capcom's masterpiece as a source of inspiration. Every encounter feels handcrafted. There's no wandering into areas where enemies are shambling around waiting for you to arrive. Instead, they constantly burst forth when you enter the scene, like actors waiting nervously in the wings of a stage production, unseen but ready to appear to play their terrifying part at a moment's notice. Like Resident Evil 4, this attention to encounter design creates a tight, varied experience which only begins to drag a little in the final third, as continued escalation leads to a slight sense of malaise. It's a problem Dead Space 3 would later suffer from during its second half, an abundance of drawn-out skirmishes with too few breaks in between, and it's not unreasonable to say that glimpses of the issue can first be spotted towards the end of 2. Valid criticism could also be levelled at the way some encounters are presented. There are quite a few occasions when Dead Space 2 feels like it's taken a leaf out of Doom 3 in the way enemies are spawned in front of you seconds before one or more appear at your rear. It also likes to frighten you by turning off the lights upon entering areas a little too much, and you can always guarantee that monster lying on the ground ahead of you is going to suddenly rise and begin its attack as you draw close. But these minor quibbles are a small price to pay for encounter design that fits well within the game's more set-piece orientated approach. They are the smaller crescendos, those that keep you on your toes while you mentally prepare for the much louder cinematic moments that bookend extended periods of gameplay. Those big budget set pieces are also incredible, which in itself is impressive as the horror genre is not one known for them. A particular favourite is the scene with Dana and the gunship, which is swiftly followed by another as Isaac is blasted out into space along with one of the larger necromorphs. And there are many more besides. Their quality remains consistently high throughout, and they're always something to look forward to. Visceral's commitment to quality when it comes to Dead Space 2's plot, pacing and encounter design extends to the many areas you explore as well. Dead Space's USG Ishimura was a cohesive environment with some variety across the different locales you explored, but what's featured in 2 is on a whole different level. The sprawl truly feels like a place where people actually lived. While the aforementioned linearity in how you journey through it might not be to everyone's taste, few could deny how well the setting fits together, even if you never get to visit half of what you can see. There is no better example of this than your time spent in the residential and shopping districts towards the game's beginning. Visceral imbues the world with an impressive sense of scale through the size of the buildings in the background, the large windows showing off the outside world, and the many people you spot trying to escape the horrors around them. If Dead Space made its world feel big through your back and forth travel across the Ishimura, then Dead Space 2 does the same thing using its backgrounds and the way it frames the wider environment. That linearity you'd think would perhaps make things feel cramped at times, and Dead Space 2 does feature its fair share of confined spaces and tight hallways, but Visceral does an excellent job of making things feel grand through their carefully designed vistas. During your travels, you also visit 3 standout areas which are the strongest across the series as a whole: the Church of Unitology, Titan Elementary School, and the USG Ishimura. Again, before going any further, I also highly recommend watching another of my videos which covers the first 2 in great detail. Click the card on screen now, as they really are spectacular. The Church of Unitology works so well because despite how far-fetched it may seem, it's a lot more believable than you might first suspect, with Unitology bearing more than a passing resemblance to Scientology. Both have beliefs rooted in the stars, whether it's worshipping the marker for Unitologists or a belief in Xenu for Scientologists. Each also places great value in their congregation's financial contributions. Scientologists rise in rank depending on their generosity, while in Dead Space 2 you can find logs discussing members' willingness to donate and their subsequent value to the church. Indeed, one of the key themes of Unitology is the idea of unification and becoming one after death.
As we await glorious convergence, it is important to continue to nurture our relationship with the marker and understand the future it is preparing for us. The marker calls to all of us. It is our duty to approach it with an open heart and open mind.
While Scientology published a series of books called the Unification Congress. Of course, Unitology's bleak irony is that it's ultimately a religion based not around life, but around death. You see outward promises of a better life for anyone who believes when you visit a Unitology centre early on, which contrasts heavily with the church itself, an imposing Gothic structure filled with the dead. The building is a strange mix of displays of opulence, religious iconography, and adverts. On the outside, the church believes in the beauty of life, that everyone eventually becomes part of a greater whole. On the inside, however, it's an organisation which pursues riches under false pretences those at the very top know are not only untrue, but are in fact the complete opposite of the nightmare its members will end up experiencing. If an area can tell a story, then there are few that do it better than the Church of Unitology. If the church has shades of cosmic horror, then Titan Elementary School is more about good old-fashioned grotesquerie. These days, there are very few avenues developers are afraid to properly explore. Violence as a broader subject definitely isn't one of them, but violence against children absolutely still is. It's not something anyone even remotely well-adjusted wants to see, and so it's not something mainstream developers tend to actively pursue. For that very reason, Visceral's bravery in including the Pack and Crawlers is impressive considering the controversy they could well have caused. The Pack, which you will have already met by the time you reach the school, are what remains of the Sprawl's older children, charging at you in, you guessed it, packs. They are unnerving in a way few of the other monstrosities featured in the series manage, and if the Pack are unnerving, then the Crawlers are downright upsetting. Created from babies, they explode on impact and are frankly a horrible thing to bear witness to. Meeting both in a school, a place once filled with happy children, is harrowing stuff, and the juxtaposition of the inviting, brightly coloured rooms adorned with children's drawings and the horror of what's happened to the children themselves is difficult to forget. Interestingly, shortly before you enter the school you can see a projection of a young girl going through some kind of religious ceremony, presumably connected to Unitology. Then, in the school, if you look closely, you might spot religious books about hymns and eternal life in some of the classrooms for older children, compared to the more traditional children's books left out for younger pupils. Putting 2 and 2 together, they're clear signs that Unitology was pervasive in many kids' lives before the outbreak occurred, and that they were likely being indoctrinated at school. Add to that logs suggesting the marker was having an effect on many of them, making them see dead relatives for example, and the hand-drawn pictures of necromorph slashers displayed on several walls, and it becomes obvious that the marker, and by extension the church, had a hugely negative influence on young lives prior to the game's events. A few hours later, after several chapters which are best described as Dead Space 2's weakest portion, you may have begun to believe that the game had run out of tricks. And then you return to the USG Ishimura. A shadow of its former self, the former planet cracker sits forlorn and abandoned, and while 2 does have some quieter moments, this section's opening is by far the longest. You spend many minutes moving through the ship before much of anything happens, with only its creaking and whispers from an unknown source breaking the otherwise unsettling silence.
You can pretend not to be bothered, but being here while she touches an Isaac. All this plastic and tape covering the scars. Try to hide the blood and the body so no one will ever know. But you remember what happened, no matter how deeply you try to bury
It's an homage to Dead Space as well as commentary on it. Visceral returns to a more horror-focused vibe, while also acknowledging through the way the Ishimura is presented, old and of no use, that the original isn't how they do things any longer. Eventually, necromorphs do make their presence known, surprise surprise, and the best moment comes after your first few fights, when you enter a decontamination room. If you'd played Dead Space prior, you knew what to expect here, that the jets would turn on and many monsters would come running. But that doesn't happen. It's not until you make your way through the area past it and then return that all hell breaks loose, and it's a lovely way of toying with your expectations. It is one of the sequel's best scares. The rest of the Ishimura is fairly routine. Ultraviolet lights highlighting the scale of the cleanup operation are a lovely touch, but much of the rest sticks to mostly established conventions. As impressive as those three areas are, closely followed quality-wise by 2's opening hours in the residential parts of the sprawl, not every setting reaches the high bar they set. There's decidedly less excitement to be found in chapters 7, 8 and 9 for example, during which you're tasked with busy work across multiple unexciting industrial environments. That being said, I suppose in their own way they do help make chapter 10 and your return to the Ishimura feel all the more engaging. After leaving the Ishimura, there are 2 more pedestrian chapters as you travel through mines and repair a gigantic drill, before things become more absorbing again upon reaching the government centre and Dead Space 2's final chapters. While they're not as brilliant as the amazing trio I just highlighted, chapter 13's set piece where Isaac cuts the power to allow floods of necromorphs to charge into the facility is another one of the game's most recognisable scenes. It's a wonderfully terrifying thing to witness, which reminds you of the necromorphs' overwhelming power during a time when you may have become accustomed to slaying them in huge numbers and perhaps even see them as less of a threat. In totality, there is a strong mix of different chapter styles, even if a few err more on the banal side of things. Sure, some of them are less exciting, but 2's gameplay being so excellent and the plot kicking much more into gear as you progress, means even the less intriguingly designed levels stacked towards the game's latter half still have something to offer. All of Visceral's hard work crafting such lovely levels would be for naught, however, if Dead Space 2's graphics and sound design weren't fantastic, and thankfully both of them are. When it comes to graphics, 2 builds on its predecessor's solid foundations, tidying up its visuals across the board, although describing it as an enormous leap in fidelity would be a step too far. Much like the original, lighting and shadows play an important part and are used to great effect across the entirety of the game. On many occasions, you'll see only a shadow to warn you something horrible is lurking nearby, and sometimes, to keep you guessing, you won't even end up being confronted by anything after. Lighting is also used at times to disorientate you, especially during the opening chapters. While traversing narrow hallways filled with shops may seem like fairly bread and butter encounter design, the use of bright lights and signage elevates the experience, with enemies becoming harder to track as they move in and out of more or less lit areas. Similarly, fog is used to obscure your view, affording you less time to react to any necromorphs scampering towards you. Those all sound like small touches on their own, but when combined with the areas themselves, the enemies within them, and the first-rate sound design, they do a great deal to build atmosphere. Speaking of sound design, Dead Space 2 builds on Visceral's stellar work in the first game. I say sound design, as while there is music and most of the tracks range from solid to fantastic, it's the diegetic audio which really shines. I mentioned a couple of times earlier the screams of the sprawl's residents filling the air, but that is but one of the many ways background noises are used to build tension. There's the whirring and clanking of machinery, jingles and assorted adverts, announcements over the tannoys, and most importantly, the necromorphs themselves. At their base level, the sounds the various monstrosities you meet make serve to foster feelings of anxiety and dread. Exploders make the most human noises, they sound like they're almost shouting at Isaac. The pack and crawlers let out the horrifying childlike wails you'd expect of them. Even cysts, necromorphs of barely any note, have a distinct wheeze you'll hear from afar to alert you to their presence. Sometimes you'll also hear noises of creatures above you, perhaps on a different floor or rattling around in vents. Sometimes you'll hear them inside inaccessible rooms or even below you. You may never find out what creature was making them, but that's sort of the point. Every unfamiliar sound is a stark reminder during less action-packed moments that necromorphs are everywhere, and that you're bound to meet another one, or 5, in the not too distant future. The horrendous wails, cackles and screams your enemies make also have a secondary function. They act as a radar of sorts. With so many necromorphs charging directly at you during Dead Space 2, focusing on anything other than immediate threats ahead of you can be tricky. Regardless, monsters will frequently appear beside or behind you at the same time, which means their various noises become the great leveller, highlighting exactly where they are outside your field of view. Without them, combat would be extremely frustrating, with enemies attacking from areas unseen before you have even a moment to react. Their noises are a helping hand, guiding you from necromorph to necromorph, as well as a bleak reminder of insurmountable odds and the fact you're surrounded. It's fortunate then that even at its most stressful, Dead Space 2 is an absolute blast to play. The encounter design mentioned earlier makes every confrontation feel like its own unique challenge, and with new weapons including the javelin gun on offer, the means to overcome those challenges is more varied than ever. The beauty of these weapons, old and new, is that you could choose to use just one of them for the entire game and still make it through relatively unscathed. They're all great fun to use, and they're all useful in their own way. Stasis and Kinesis return from the first game too, and behave in a similar manner, although I do quickly want to highlight their introductions. Each serves as an excellently designed teachable moment, with situations set up that expressly show you how to use them in-world with minimal hand-holding. Isaac salvaging both from nearby machinery fits perfectly with him being an engineer too. That being said, there are still pop-ups at times explaining the game's controls and similar, which I'm not fond of. They're reminders, albeit brief ones, that you are still playing a video game. It is so much fun making use of the many tools at your disposal. Isaac's movement and the weight behind it and the varied animations on display pair very well with the weapons on offer, Stasis and Kinesis, to give a real thud and feeling of heft to combat. While Isaac does feel a touch nimbler than in Dead Space, the heavy feeling to combat as a whole sits beautifully alongside the necromorph's frantic movements, creating a real contrast between speed and weight. Enemies retain the same sense of kineticism they were so brilliantly imbued with in the first game too, crumbling under shots from the plasma cutter or rifle, or flying backwards when hit with the force or javelin guns. The variety of necromorphs out for blood helps ensure combat remains fresh too. Along with the crawlers and the pack, two definite highlights, the new stalker necromorphs are a fantastic change of pace. Granted, it's usually pretty obvious when they're about to appear, as they mainly lie in wait in rooms with plenty of corners and cover dotted about for them to poke their heads around.
Isaac! I don't think I can open now!
And while they do lose some of their shock factor the more you meet them, they never get to the point of feeling overused. Their shrieks are unnerving, they sound like they're communicating with each other, and the moments they choose to charge always cause panic, especially if you're also trying to keep track of where several others are while one of them rapidly approaches. Of the returning necromorphs, the only real letdown is the Ubermorph, who chases you during the game's closing moments. His basic role is that of a timer, there to ensure you continue moving forwards at pace, but Dead Space 2 already moves so briskly that its inclusion is unnecessary. The Ubermorph is more of an annoyance than something which adds anything of true value, and in all honesty, it is yet another example of an unkillable enemy who isn't particularly enjoyable to encounter. It's quite funny too, because if there's one thing you'd think Visceral might have done away with from Dead Space, it's the zero gravity sections, which weren't great in the original but are vastly improved in 2. Realising how much better the sequel's take on the concept is provides a real wow moment, unexpected for such a previously divisive mechanic, with Isaac given freedom of movement within spaces rather than needing to jump from surface to surface. Visceral nails the feeling of propulsion, and Isaac is a real joy to control. The zero-G portions are essentially swimming sections in the way they're set up, except instead of being submerged in water, you're suspended in space. It feels appropriate that the last major topic discussed during this video is the game's ending, where Visceral continues the trend of making something it would have been so easy to falter on feel flawless. First, Tideman has to be dealt with.
I won't let you throw all this away.
And once he's out of the way, a final battle to rid Isaac of the marker's influence over him begins, with the malevolent artifact taking Nicole's form in his mind. Dead Space featured the standard gigantic enemy far bigger than anything you've previously encountered final battle, which there's nothing wrong with, but Dead Space 2's ending feels far more intimately connected with events leading up to it. The spotlight for much of the story is on Isaac's mental health, and so it makes perfect sense for the game's last encounter to not be one against a towering necromorph. After nearly 2 games, Isaac has already proven his physical strength 1,000 times over, making the struggle for his mind a considerably more interesting conflict. Defeating the marker is a huge moment for him too. He finally forgives himself and is consequently able to vanquish his inner demons, much like he's continued to vanquish physical ones throughout the rest of the story. At long last, he's then able to sit down and take stock of everything that's happened. He's finally at peace and accepts that there may not be anything else to do other than die. Except, just when it looks like all hope is lost, Ellie arrives in the nick of time to ferry Isaac to safety. It helps cement her place as a heroic character in her own right, and once Isaac is safely on board the ship, the game also uses her as part of its last big trick. The camera pans round Isaac much like it does during the ending of the first game, except this time there are no visions of a demonic Nicole, only Ellie smiling back at him. It's a great tongue-in-cheek moment, a final sign-off by Visceral that reads, "Even when we're not scaring you, we can still surprise you." In the end, that's what Dead Space 2 was when it released back in 2010, a surprise. Visceral could have simply released an update which went through the motions, one where Isaac explored another ship with a few new bits and bobs added here and there to ensure the experience still felt fresh. Instead, what we got was a follow-up which not only built on the original, but also stands alone as a uniquely brilliant experience in its own right. It's enough like the series' first outing to please fans, but also features plenty of new touches and tweaks to the existing formula to ensure it remains enthralling throughout. If you've played Dead Space 2 before, then you'll know what I'm talking about, and if you haven't, hopefully this video has gone some way to explaining why it's so wonderful. No matter whether you're in the first camp or the second, it is definitely worth revisiting it or firing it up for the first time to see what all the fuss is about, because I guarantee you'll have a fantastic time playing what is undoubtedly one of the best video game sequels ever created. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and engineers. I know it's a long one, so I appreciate you sticking with me. If you had a frighteningly good time, do consider liking, subscribing and sharing your memories of Dead Space 2, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon.